If we have identified their ultimate concerns as religious,
yes,
then how could the FBI have used those ultimate concerns to resolve the crises peacefully? FBI is thinking that they're going to try to resolve it by threat and by force and by denial. They don't want to deal with the religious ideology. But we have come to the point where we believe that that was the one way it could have been resolved, because these ideas were that important to them. They would not betray them, no more than a Catholic's going to betray the Eucharist. These are religious symbols to them.
Well, not all the FBI agents thought that they could resolve the situation through threat and violence and tactical actions. The behavioral scientists, the negotiators, wanted to resolve the situation through negotiations. And the negotiators will use a term which is saving face. Try to work out a resolution in which the subject is able to save face. Now, we religious studies scholars, we would use a different term, but I think it gets to the same thing, which is that these people have an ultimate concern, a concern that's the most important thing to them in the whole world. They'll live or die for it. The Branch Davidians were very clear that they would live and die for it if necessary. They didn't want to die, but they would die if the events transpired. And so we would say negotiate terms that enables them to remain true to their ultimate concern. Let David find some prophecies that will allow him to come out. And I think that's what the negotiators would understand as saving face.
Yes, it was very important then for the FBI not to precipitate the fulfillment of the prophecies that would lead to the conclusion of the fifth seal and the beginning of the terrible sixth seal. So I drove to Waco, and I did my best to go to the press conferences where the FBI was. It was very difficult to get in there. I was asked to leave by the Waco police and escorted out. I got back in, I talked to the agents. It was a difficult time to get anyone to actually listen. And even though I left business cards and gave my information to Bob Ricks, for example, really no interest was shown.
And you have a PhD in biblical interpretation, so
and I
it's not
explained
as though
that to
you're just
them.
some guy that shows up.
Yes, I explained all that. And basically the comment I got was, you cannot understand this man. No one can understand David Koresh. He is speaking Bible babble. And 3 times I approached that agent. And 3 times he told me the same thing.
Just nonsense.
So just nonsense. Yeah. You cannot do anything to help at all. And so I knew then that we were going to have a tough time working through law enforcement, because they wanted to keep the whole conversation on food, sending children out, milk, telephone contact, and when you're going to surrender. Whereas David was talking about his religious faith, that something eschatological and apocalyptic was happening in Waco, Texas.
Phil, if you remember, we felt at that point we need to get some teaching, really. We need to learn. And there was one of the people that was released, Livingston Fagan, who actually was a very well-educated theological scholar, Seventh-day Adventist school. I think he had a master's degree. And he was in jail in Waco.
Did Livingston say that it was inevitable that the rest of them would die, that the rest of the Branch Davidians would die?
No, there was not any idea of inevitability. Livingstone is saying that if the world will simply listen to the message and give them a chance to a fair hearing, then things would not end in calamity. But he did believe that if the world rejected the message and would try to attack the people of God, then God would exact vengeance for his people.
He thought it was a test.
Yeah, it's more of a test
for the world.
Yes, on the world. But what I don't understand, will never understand, is why didn't the authorities sit down with Livingstone Fagan and ask him, what is David Koresh thinking the prophecies are going to end in? What is the steps to resolve the crises
or
according
teach us your
to
faith
their religious
so
beliefs?
We understand it.
They
Yeah.
did not do that. That's an abject failure on the part of law enforcement. So really, then the FBI misses that opportunity. That option they missed. They did not sit down and talk to Fagan. And they did not call me and ask, well, what did Fagan say? Although they knew for sure they could call me, because they had called me about certain other issues when they wanted something. For example, there was another untried option in the middle of March. I had gone on the radio out of Dallas, giving just a brief discussion of what the 7 seals were all about. It so happens that the Branch Davidians heard that program that morning, and they called the FBI when they had the phone line hooked up for negotiations. And Steve asked the FBI agent.
Now explain who Steve is.
Oh, Steve Schneider was the right-hand man of David Koresh. He had a master's in theology. He did a lot of the talking on the negotiation tapes. A true believer, but someone who was trying to weigh the evidence and see how much he should follow Koresh's teachings and how biblical they were.
He was very
impressed,
sincere and
very
rational.
sincere and
when he
rational.
listened, yeah. Mhm.
And so he asked the FBI, he says, there's someone we heard on the radio, some fellow named Dr. Phil Arnold from Houston, Texas. He seems to know something about the 7 seals. Wonder if we could get he and David on the telephone together. And if Arnold can show us something that David doesn't know or has wrong, we will leave. We are out of here. And the agents never put me on the phone with David Koresh or Steve or anyone inside. That option was untried. They preferred, I guess, to insert C.S. Guess first.
Well, not only were they not listening to you, advice from a Bible scholar, they were not listening to their own behavioral scientists. And so just like the two of you felt like you need to learn about the worldview, FBI agents were gathering intelligence about what David Koresh and the Branch Davidians believed. So in the Lee Hancock collection, which is in the archive at Texas State University, there are many, many memos about interviews with people who knew the Branch Davidians, current Branch Davidians, former Branch Davidians, family members of Branch Davidians. Each one was written up in a memo. And then these were compiled reports. There were 4 compiled reports that were written. One was called Suicide References. That's dated March 27th. Then Passover's coming, so they compiled a series of references, statements from people they had interviewed. That document's titled Passover Summary. That's April 1st. Then on the day before the final assault, April 18th, you had a Passover addendum and a suicide addendum. And the people they interviewed had a consensus that David Koresh was not suicidal. Committing suicide was against his religious faith, but he had predicted that they would be assaulted and attacked, die, they would be killed. And so quite a few of the people that were interviewed stated the opinion that David Koresh was capable of setting up a suicide by cop scenario, a conflict in which the Branch Davidians would die. Then there were 2 behavioral scientists, Pete Smerick and Mark Young, who wrote a series of memos advising the FBI agents to pull back. Don't apply pressure. If you pull back, you're taking power away from David Koresh because you're not fulfilling his prophecies. If you take an aggressive approach, children will die. And so they wrote 3 very strong memos telling FBI agents to pull back. But then finally, under pressure, they wrote a memo saying use aggressive tactics to break the spirit of David Koresh. But later they gave interviews internally to the FBI saying that that last memo was written under pressure. So
I'm surprised they agreed.
They did, unfortunately. So they had warnings from their own behavioral scientists. They had warnings from a Bible scholar on site who was trying to communicate with them. They even had warnings from Mark Brault. he kept calling, and finally the people in Australia were interviewed,
Ex-members, yeah.
ex-members.
Saying
So
be careful.
everybody was telling them not to assault. It would be very dangerous if an assault was carried out.
Well, I've heard you quote Clive Doyle, one of the survivors, just the very logical thing that if you got the quote, but if David's deranged and the group's, mentally unstable, what was to me, that
Well,
was so logical when I heard it.
In the movie, Waco Rules of Engagement, Clive states, if they thought we were all a bunch of crazies, a bunch of cultists, why did they push David and us to the edge? And then actually in the fictionalized 6-part Paramount miniseries titled Waco, the Gary Nessner character, played by Michael Shannon, said, he's talking to the character representing Jeff Jamar, and he says, you're taking a guy who's unstable, or you believe is unstable, and you're trying to drive him crazy to get him to cooperate.
Yeah, I think one of the big mistakes was when the FBI got the impression that David Koresh was conning them. And one time they give him an acid test and they speak to him and they say, well, one of the agents says, well, I'm very confident in my personal relationship with Jesus Christ, David. That was a test to see if David would say, well, wait a minute, I'm the Christ. You shouldn't be confident in Jesus. You should be confident in me. But David didn't say that. David was kind of gentlemanly about it. Well, I'm really happy that you have that relationship, There's more to learn about the 7 seals. And the agent thought, well, wait a minute. I know from my own religious perspective and my belief in Jesus that a real Jesus, Christ-type figure would try to convert me. So that's an example of the FBI using their own religious presuppositions to make a value judgment. So they're not willing to open up to religious scholars to help them interpret the situation, but they were using their own religious presuppositions to interpret the situation. That's a fatal flaw.
I think there is 2 positive things to point to with regard to the FBI and the hostage rescue team, and jump in if you want to, Kathy, on this one. We saw changes in the structure of the FBI's hostage rescue team after Waco because they recognized that and I think that we can take some credit for this, I'm talking about the scholars, Waco scholars, in that because the crisis negotiation team didn't have the same voice, equal voice that the tactical team did, that the negotiation team was elevated to the same footing as the tactical team in future hostage barricade or crisis situations.
Did that get tested out then, the new policy?
It actually did get tested out a few years after Waco in Montana, involving a standoff with a sovereign citizen group called the Montana Freemen.
What year was that?
1996. We saw the negotiators willing to talk to or include third-party negotiators. In fact, Phil and Kathy, I think, were there.
Well, they consulted with some scholars, including Michael Barkin. We weren't in touch with Michael at the time, but he was one of their consultants. And then Phil and I and Gene Rosenfeld, we provided advice to negotiators. The critical incident response group had already been created. Robin Montgomery was the first commander or director of SERG. And as you mentioned, the negotiators were on equal footing with the hostage rescue team. They reported directly to the commander, who was Robin Montgomery. They met together. That was and also Gary Nessner was the head of negotiation at that time, and he got to implement all of the good negotiation techniques there.
Isn't that kind of wonderful that he,
It is, yeah.
taken off Waco, but then he gets to
And
come
look
back
at the
and
outcome
follow
of
his
Montana.
vision.
They waited 81 days for this group to come
longer.
out, much longer. With regard to the media, I'm largely disappointed that with all these documentaries that I looked at on the 25th anniversary, in so many of them, they're just relying on simplistic cult stereotypes. They're leaning more towards salacious kind of tabloidish journalism. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, 4 of the 6 documentaries that I looked at didn't interview a single scholar. I mean, there's an enormous body of research now, research literature, peer-reviewed, published literature on Waco, and these journalists, filmmakers, basically didn't bother to even look at it.
Now, can I tell you a secret?
Sure.
2 of those 4 did interview. One of them,
That's right.
me, and the other, Dr. Arnold, extensively, 3
Okay.
4 hours.
Oh.
Just like we've done today.
Okay.
And later called us and said, we've decided not to include any.
Oh my
of your
gosh.
interview."
That's-
Usually it would be like, really sorry we had to cut it a lot. You know, it's not as much as we wanted. It's like, we decided not to go that route.
2 different networks. did
2
that.
network. These are networks.
So essentially they made some kind of decision that they were going to go with the cult stereotype version, and you would have spoiled the party.
Yeah, they weren't talking about how it could have been resolved. They were talking about how weird and crazy these people are, and isn't this what happens when you have weird and crazy people? Let this be a warning to those who would be weird and crazy, that kind of idea.
I think they had a faith that they would be able to be protected through this thing. That is, that their lives were not over with. There was a future. They were going to return in power and glory. So this wasn't like a suicide pact. It was perhaps a translation into a different realm that they were feeling. But they also quoted the passage, I think it's in Isaiah, where you will run like through the flames, through flames. And in Joel, there's a confidence that God's army would be able to go through these types of problems, whether it be a fire or whatever. Also, they're building on this whole tradition in the Bible that the righteous remnant will suffer. I mean, you have that, the suffering servant in Isaiah for Israel. Jesus is crucified. So it's as if all these things, from the point of view of the Davidians, here at the very end, it looks like the end time scenario, all the parts that the prophecies predict are being played out by the individuals involved. They're the righteous group. David is the Messiah figure. You have the Messianic children. Then you have the authorities who are playing the role of Herod and Pilate and Caesar, bringing about the crucifixion of the community. So, ironically, the FBI, who surely doesn't want the women and children and men and everyone to burn up, that's not their hope. They're hoping to resolve the crisis somehow, I would think. But they actually wound up playing the roles of Herod and Pilate and Caesar.
Mm-hmm. And as you pointed out, there'll be a resurrection afterwards. You know, David will be resurrected as the end-time Christ, leading an army of the 200 million martyrs of all the ages, those which will include the Branch Davidians who died, but and these the 200 million martyrs of all the ages who come back with David, they're the wave sheaf. They're the first of the first fruits, but they're also the living wave sheaf. Those Branch Davidian survivors who didn't die in the fire, but who gave their all for their faith in God and His prophecies. And so they'll be part of that wave sheaf also when the time comes. So there is a hope after that.
So many of them still, they believe that David will return then.
They do.
Just as the Christians believe Jesus would return. Yeah.
The Branch Davidians were waiting on God. They were waiting to see what God had in store for them. I'm quoting one of the Branch Davidian women. And when the attack happened, especially after the children and mothers were gassed, I think probably the Branch Davidians felt like they had their answer about what God had in store for them.
Well, I'll say this from the standpoint of religious studies, and I think sociology and anthropology are the same. We consider this generally to be delusional thinking, that you can walk through fire, that you're going to fly up to heaven, simply because when people believe this sort of thing, they end up dead. For anything from I'll jump off a building and God will catch me or whatever. But so many cases throughout history of people who did believe these things that you're foolish not to take into account, even if you think it's a delusion. They don't think it's a delusion. They think it's real. And so you can't judge it by a skeptical attitude. It's like, of course God's not going to destroy the FBI with an earthquake and David will call down the wrath. That's a joke to secular people, but it's not a joke to them. I could say, I'd like to say that I like that question about, well, let's say the 28th never happened.
All right.
There's no raid.
Okay, no
David
raid.
Koresh is living at the Mount Carmel Center. He's got 123 followers. I don't think it would have probably amounted to much. Maybe that will help my critics to know that I'm not a believer in this message. I think there were just so many liabilities depending on these imminent prophetic scenarios. I don't think they would have come up. Well, they haven't come about. Here we are decades later. None of what David said was going to happen has happened. And this is the history of what I study. I often start my classes, I said, I don't want to be cynical, but we're studying an idea that has a 100% failure rate. Keep that in mind. Nothing wrong with studying it. We're essentially documenting disappointment and, as you mentioned, when prophecy fails. That's what you wrote in your book, When the Millennium Comes Violently. This is what we want to understand it. And also it's the foundation of our Judeo-Christian civilization and Islam.
Yes.
All of these movements began with this eschatological apocalypticism. Now, a lot of them have evolved. Episcopalians don't strike me today as
Or Methodists.
but they're reading a Bible that says the appointed time has grown very short. Give up your wives, give up what you have, right? So it's still part of our culture. That's why we study it. And there are people that come along that say, well, wait a minute. If Jesus said this and we believe in him, shouldn't we do it? Or if Isaiah said the Lord's going to shake the earth, say I'm Jewish, I read Isaiah 24, and it's because we've polluted the earth, then maybe this is a prophecy of what's happening. People can read the Bible for themselves now. It's in all the languages, so.
See the signs of the times, right?
Signs of the times, yeah.
So I would have to agree that you wouldn't have had this great clash between the Branch Davidians and the citizens of Waco or the government that some people were thinking would happen had the raid not. I don't think they were going to use the weapons to harm anybody. They were just selling them at the gun shows. And they were preparing for prophecies that may happen in the future. If the apocalypse had not been delivered by the government, then you wouldn't have had the apocalyptic scenarios that unfolded. I do think, though, that we may have heard of the Davidians, the Branch Davidians, because I think David would still have thought of himself as having a messianic mission. And I would like to think that his love of music, remember now, that was how he was going to get his message out, was through music. That was what he was hoping to do. So he had musicians, many musicians with him, and he was a credible musician himself. And it just so happens, about a year after the raid's February 28th, 1993. So by August 1994, Woodstock is being held. Woodstock is being held. 500,000 people came to it. August 1994. All these rock bands. I think David Koresh would have been there with his rock band, performing as a messianic group. And he would have looked for converts. He would like to have persuaded some of those 500,000 people to follow him. If he got David Thibodeau and a few other musicians that he happened to meet in a bar, I got a feeling he would have grown his group through music, and that may have been the place he would have started. I think it would have just been good music. I don't think there would have been anything more than that happening.
I've got a secret that I'd like you to understand. See the book there in the angel's hand, book of Daniel. It's got a message for you, a message for you. The angel cries as a lion begins to roar. Secrets are told, mysteries in life to store. What's the thunder? Who knows? Don't you understand? Book is sealed. The angel stands on earth and the sea. Don't it make you cry? All that we can see the cloud, feel the rainfall. Don't you understand? Thunders, all heard the voice. Now you know you've got to make a choice. Will you listen to the mystery of life, the mystery of life? Oh. See the angel with a book in his hand, the book of Daniel. It contains the eternal plan, 7 thunders. Won't you see? Won't you listen to me? We've got the key. There's the voice of the seventh angel. When it shall begin to sound, Babylon's gonna fall, gonna come to the ground.
So how's God going to talk to me in the latter days?
It's going to be written.
And who's going to bring that book? So there'll be no excuses. In Psalms 40, you learn by the key of David, I waited patiently on the Lord. He inclined to me when he heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit and out of the miry clay, established my feet on a rock. Where's the rock at, class?
Heaven.
And established my goings. When Christ comes again into the world, is he going to walk in the light of his own mind or in the light of his Father's Word? Word. He put also a new song in my heart. Many shall see it and fear and trust in the name of the Lord. Why would that be? Right? Offering and sacrifice God does not require. My ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering dost not desire. Then said I, one last offering, then said I, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O God. Thy laws within my heart. Well, Revelation says Christ's going to come with a what? And who wrote it? God. And what's it about? Christ. The revelation of Jesus which God gave to who? Him. To show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now 2,000 years is not short. But when does Christ come? As soon as he receives the Lord. Of which John the Revelator stated clearly, this must be hereafter. Not the Catholic Church must be hereafter. Not the Lutherans or the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Baptists or the Millerite or Adventists. Not all the theories of man. The gospel's fulfilled on the cross. Forgive them, they don't know what they do. Therefore, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you is the gospel and the power of it in Christ. Who's going to get what? There's going to be a judgment in heaven. Only one question. I don't care if you're into drugs. Drugs are bad. You should know you're into them. They're killing you. I don't care if you're an alcoholic. You know that alcohol is wrong. I don't care if you can't keep your marriage together. All I care about when I judge men is one thing. Do you want to know the 7 seals? Do you want to know where they are?